True wealth isn't about being noticed. It's about the freedom to just be yourself.
Marcus Coleman built his fortune from nothing, and he never let himself forget it. 30 years ago, he was sweeping floors in a warehouse outside Atlanta, counting coins to make sure he had enough for a bus ride home. Now his name sat on buildings in 4 cities. His company managed logistics contracts worth more than some small nations, and yet every single morning, he still checked the price of milk out of habit. Wealth had not changed the part of him that remembered hunger. It had only given him the power to test the people around him, quietly, without them ever knowing they were being watched. He believed money revealed character faster than any conversation ever could. And that belief was about to lead him into a diner on the outskirts of Charlotte, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, where a woman named Renee Thomas was about to change everything he thought he understood about people. If you've ever wondered whether small acts of honesty still matter in a world that rewards everything except that, stay with this story until the end, because what happens next will answer that question in a way you won't expect. Subscribe now if stories about character, choice, and quiet redemption speak to you, because there's more waiting for you on this channel. Marcus had learned early that people showed him 2 different faces. There was the face reserved for men who wore expensive suits and sat in glass offices, full of careful words and calculated respect. And there was the face people wore when they believed the man across from them had nothing to offer, nothing to threaten, and nothing worth performing for. Marcus had spent decades chasing that second face because he had come to believe it was the only honest one. Boardrooms had taught him plenty about strategy and leverage, but they had taught him almost nothing about who a person truly was underneath the polish. For that kind of truth, he had to go where people didn't know to hide it. The diner was called Ruthie's, a squat brick building with a faded sign and a parking lot that never quite got repaved. It sat wedged between a tire shop and a shuttered furniture store, the kind of place that had survived on regulars and low prices for 30 years without ever bothering to update its menu boards. It wasn't the kind of place Marcus Coleman was supposed to be seen in, at least according to his assistant, who had begged him more than once to let the car service handle his morning coffee from somewhere with better security and a private entrance. Marcus ignored the advice the way he always did. He liked disappearing into ordinary places. He liked watching how people behaved when they thought no one important was in the room, because that was the only laboratory that ever gave him real answers. He wore a plain gray jacket that morning. No watch, no rings, nothing that would give away the numbers behind his name. He picked a booth near the back, ordered black coffee and eggs, and studied the room the way he studied everything, quietly, patiently, looking for the truth beneath the surface. An older man in a trucker's cap argued gently with the cook about the score of a game from the night before. 2 teenagers shared a plate of fries before school, counting out change from a small pile of coins. A woman in scrubs sat alone reading something on her phone, her shoulders slack with the particular exhaustion of someone coming off a night shift. Marcus noticed all of it, cataloging details out of habit, the way other men might notice stock tickers. Renee Thomas had been on her feet since 5 that morning. She was 34 years old, raising 2 children alone since her husband left 18 months earlier, and working double shifts most days just to keep the lights on. Her son Malik was 8, prone to asthma attacks that sent her running for his inhaler more nights than she liked to count. Her daughter Aaliyah was 11, quiet and watchful in a way that made Renee worry she was growing up faster than she should have to. Renee moved through the diner with the kind of tired efficiency that comes from years of practice, refilling coffee, clearing plates, keeping a smile on her face even when her lower back ached and her feet had gone numb hours ago. She did not know the man in the gray jacket owned half the trucking routes that kept this town supplied. To her, he was just another customer, quiet, polite, tipping fairly, nothing more. She topped off his coffee twice without being asked, noticed he liked his eggs a certain way after the first refill, and adjusted the second time without comment. It was a small thing, the kind of attentiveness that came naturally to her, born less from training and more from a genuine habit of paying attention to the people in front of her, even when her own mind was consumed with worry about the overdue rent notice sitting unopened on her kitchen counter at home. Marcus had a habit, one he rarely spoke about, even to the people closest to him. Whenever he traveled to a new city, he would leave money behind on purpose, sometimes $20, sometimes more, folded loosely under a napkin or tucked half visible beneath a coffee cup. It was never about the money itself. It was about what people did when they believed no one was watching. Most of the time, the money disappeared into a pocket without a second thought, and Marcus never held that against anyone, understanding that hardship made temptation reasonable rather than shameful. Occasionally, someone would chase him down the street to return it. Those moments, rare as they were, stayed with him longer than any business deal he had ever closed. That morning, as he stood to leave, he slid $2,000 in cash beneath a folded napkin near his coffee cup, more than he usually left, almost as if some instinct told him this particular test deserved higher stakes. Then he walked out the door without looking back. Renee found the money almost immediately. She had gone to clear his table, and her hand brushed the edge of the napkin before she saw the thick fold of bills underneath. Her breath caught. $2,000. She had never held that much cash in her life outside of a paycheck that vanished within days of arriving. Her mind moved fast, running through everything that money could fix. The car repair she'd been putting off for 3 weeks, the one making a grinding sound every time she braked. The rent notice, now 11 days overdue, with a late fee compounding by the day. Malik's asthma medication, which she had been rationing because the copay had doubled since the new year, stretching each refill 2 extra weeks longer than it was meant to last. For one long moment, she stood frozen at that table, staring at more money than she had seen in a single place in years. She thought about her mother, who had raised 4 children on a nursing assistant salary and still found $10 every Christmas to slip into a stranger's collection jar outside the grocery store, no matter how tight things were that year. She thought about the woman who had once returned Renee's own dropped wallet years ago, cash untouched, when Renee had nothing, and that $40 had meant the difference between eating that week and not. She remembered standing on a sidewalk at 19 years old, crying with relief as a stranger handed her wallet back without a second thought, and she remembered promising herself that if she was ever on the other side of a moment like that, she would be the kind of person who gave the same relief to someone else. Character isn't tested in the moments when everyone is watching, her mother used to say. It's tested in the moments when no one would ever know the difference. Renee folded the napkin closed around the money, tucked it into her apron pocket, and walked toward the door where the man in the gray jacket had just stepped out into the parking lot. Marcus was halfway to his car when he heard footsteps behind him, quick and urgent, and then her voice calling out, asking him to wait. He turned, already knowing what this meant, though he never let his face show anticipation. Renee held out the napkin, her hand slightly unsteady, and told him he'd left something behind on the table. Marcus looked down at the money, then back up at her, studying her face the way he studied every detail that mattered in his life. There was no performance in her expression, no hope for a reward, only the plain discomfort of someone who simply wanted to return what wasn't hers. He asked her name. She told him, Renee, and mentioned almost apologetically that it was a lot of money to leave lying around, in case he hadn't realized how much was folded inside. Marcus thanked her, took the money, and got in his car, watching her walk back inside through his rearview mirror before he pulled away. If you've ever faced a moment where doing the right thing cost you something you desperately needed, you already understand what Renee gave up in that parking lot. Keep watching, because Marcus was not finished with her, not by a long way, and what he does next will show you exactly why quiet honesty rarely goes unanswered forever. Marcus did not drive away immediately. He sat in his car at the edge of the lot for several minutes, watching Renee walk back inside, already pulling her apron straight, already moving on to her next table as though nothing significant had happened at all. For most people, $2,000 handed back without hesitation would have been the end of the story, an isolated act of decency in an ordinary day. For Marcus, it was the beginning of a question he could not ignore. He had run this same quiet test in a dozen cities over the years, and the honest ones were rare enough that he remembered every face. Most people hesitated at least a little, weighing the decision even briefly before doing the right thing. Renee had not hesitated at all, not even for the length of a breath. That absence of hesitation told him something he needed to understand. He asked his assistant, a careful and discreet woman named Patrice who had worked for him for over a decade, to quietly look into Ruthie's diner and its staff. Nothing invasive, simply enough to understand who Renee Thomas was. What came back over the following days painted a picture he had seen before, because it had once been his own. 2 children, a husband who had walked away when things became difficult, leaving behind child support payments that arrived late or not at all. A mountain of medical bills from Malik's ongoing asthma treatment, including a hospital visit the previous winter that had put her thousands of dollars into debt. A landlord threatening eviction over back rent that had piled up during a stretch of missed shifts when Renee herself had needed minor surgery and lost 2 weeks of income she could not afford to lose. She had every reason in the world to keep that money, more reason than most people Marcus had tested over the years, and she had returned it without a moment's pause. Marcus read through the details Patrice had gathered late one night in his office. The city lights spread out below him through floor-to-ceiling windows, and found himself thinking not about strategy or opportunity, but about his own mother. He remembered her working 2 jobs, one in a laundromat and one in a school cafeteria. Remembered the winter she turned down an envelope of cash from a relative because she believed the money had been meant for someone with a greater need than their own family. He remembered resenting that decision as a boy, cold in a coat 2 sizes too small, wondering why principle had to come before survival. It took him 20 years and considerable success to understand that his mother's refusal was the exact foundation the rest of his character had been built upon. Watching Renee's file build on his desk, he saw the same foundation forming in a woman who had every reason to abandon it. He returned to the diner 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, never revealing who he was, simply observing from his usual booth near the back. He watched her defend a co-worker, a nervous young server named Tanya, from a manager's unfair blame during a chaotic Saturday rush, calmly stepping in and correcting the record even though it wasn't her place to. He watched her quietly pay for an elderly customer's meal out of her own tip money when the man came up short of the register, sliding a few crumpled bills across the counter before the man even noticed what had happened. He watched her stay 40 minutes past her shift to help a new hire understand a register system, refusing the extra pay her manager offered for the trouble, insisting it wasn't necessary for something that simple. None of this was performed for an audience. None of it was for him. This was simply who she was when she believed no one of consequence was watching. Marcus began to understand that the parking lot moment hadn't been an exception in Renee's life. It had been an ordinary Tuesday expression of a character she carried into every corner of her day, visible or not, rewarded or not. Not everyone around Marcus understood what he was doing, and not everyone approved of it. Patrice, who had gathered the details on Renee's life, admired her boss's instincts, but worried privately about the optics of a powerful man quietly investigating a woman without her knowledge, however good his intentions were. She raised the concern carefully during one of their regular briefings, reminding Marcus that intention did not always protect a person from how an action might look if it were ever misunderstood. Marcus took the concern seriously, as he always did with Patrice, and agreed to move forward only through a formal letter rather than any further unannounced visits, wanting Renee to have full control over whether she engaged with him at all. It was a small adjustment, but it mattered to him, a reminder that even good intentions needed guardrails to stay good. His head of operations, a sharp and skeptical man named Douglas who had worked alongside Marcus for nearly 15 years, raised a different objection entirely when word of the plan reached him. Douglas had seen founders and executives get swept up in sentimental gestures before, mistaking a single compelling moment for a reliable predictor of long-term performance. He sat across from Marcus in his office and asked bluntly whether hiring someone based on one act of honesty, however admirable, was really a sound business decision or simply an emotional one dressed up in the language of values. Marcus didn't dismiss the challenge. He respected Douglas precisely because the man never simply agreed with him out of deference. Instead, Marcus laid out everything Patrice had gathered, not just the parking lot moment, but the pattern behind it, the coworker she'd defended, the elderly customer she'd quietly helped, the unpaid overtime she'd given a nervous new hire. One moment could be luck or performance, Marcus admitted. A consistent pattern across unconnected, unwitnessed situations was something else entirely, and that was what had actually convinced him. Douglas remained unconvinced until he reviewed the file himself, reading through weeks of quiet observation with the same scrutiny he applied to acquisition targets and vendor contracts. By the end of it, he admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that Marcus's instincts had held up under his skepticism better than most hiring decisions made through conventional interviews and resumes. He still recommended a standard probationary period and clear performance benchmarks, refusing to let sentiment entirely override structure. And Marcus agreed without hesitation, understanding that fairness to Renee also meant giving her a real chance to prove herself on her own merits rather than being handed a position she couldn't ultimately succeed in. It was this same rigor, applied evenly rather than waved out of charity, that would later make Renee's rapid advancement within the company feel earned rather than gifted, both to her co-workers and to herself. There was tension, too, back at Ruthie's diner in the days after Renee gave her notice. Her manager, a weary but fair woman named Gloria who had run the place for over a decade, pulled Renee aside privately, not to discourage her, but out of a mixture of worry and disbelief that made her ask pointed questions. Gloria had seen too many promises fall apart over the years, men and companies offering something too good to be true and vanishing once the paperwork was signed. She asked Renee directly whether she had a contract, whether she'd had a lawyer look anything over, whether anyone else could vouch for this company beyond a name she recognized from the news. Renee appreciated the concern rather than resenting it, understanding that Gloria's skepticism came from years of watching hardworking people get taken advantage of by exactly this kind of unexpected offer. Renee had, in fact, asked Patrice for documentation before agreeing to anything, a detail that quietly reassured Gloria more than any reputation could have. The two women embraced before Renee's final shift, Gloria admitting through tears she hadn't expected that she would miss having someone she could trust completely behind the counter. If a story like this is speaking to something you believe about how the world should work, make sure you're subscribed, because these are exactly the kinds of stories this channel exists to tell. And there's more waiting for you after this one. By the third week, Marcus made a decision that surprised even his own team. He requested a private meeting with Renee, not through the diner, but through a formal letter delivered to her home, explaining honestly who he was and what he had witnessed. Renee assumed it was some kind of mistake or scam when the letter first arrived, until she recognized the name from the news, the trucking and logistics magnate who had quietly built one of the largest privately held companies in the Southeast. Her hands shook reading it a second time at her kitchen table, Aaliyah peering over her shoulder curiously, trying to understand why a man like that would have any interest in her life at all. She called the number listed twice before working up the nerve to let it ring through, half expecting the whole thing to dissolve into some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. If a story like this is speaking to something you believe about how the world should work, make sure you're subscribed, because these are exactly the kinds of stories this channel exists to tell, and there's more waiting for you after this one. Renee arrived at the meeting wearing her only formal blazer, the one she kept for parent-teacher conferences and funerals, sitting stiffly in a lobby that cost more to decorate than she made in a year. The receptionist offered her water twice, and both times Renee declined, too nervous to trust her own hands not to shake. When Marcus finally sat across from her in a small private conference room, he did not open with business. He opened with the parking lot, the napkin, the moment she had chosen to walk outside instead of pocketing what she'd found. He told her about his mother, about the laundromat, about the years it took him to understand why some decisions had nothing to do with what a person could afford and everything to do with who they had decided to be. Renee listened, still uncertain where any of this was leading, still bracing for some catch she hadn't yet identified. She had spent years learning that kindness with strings attached was often more dangerous than no kindness at all, and some old instinct kept her guarded even as Marcus spoke with what seemed like genuine warmth. She asked him plainly, partway through, what exactly he wanted from her. Marcus respected the directness of the question and answered just as plainly. He explained that he did not build his company by finding the smartest people in every room. He built it by finding people whose character held steady whether anyone was watching or not, because those were the only people he had ever been able to trust with real responsibility, especially as his company had grown too large for him to personally oversee every decision. He told her about a logistics coordinator position that had opened at his company's regional office, a role with full medical benefits that would cover Malik's ongoing treatment many times over, stable daytime hours that would let her be home for her children in the evenings for the first time in years, and a salary nearly double what she currently earned between her shifts and tips combined. He wasn't offering her charity, and he made a point of saying so clearly, watching her face for any sign that she might mistake his intentions. He was offering her a place in an organization built specifically around the value she had already proven she carried, a chance to be seen and rewarded for exactly the kind of person she already was. Renee sat with that offer for a long moment, turning it over, half expecting to wake up from what felt too generous to be real. She thought about the eviction notice still tucked in her kitchen drawer, about Malik's inhaler running low again, about the exhaustion that had become simply a permanent condition of her life rather than something temporary to push through. She asked him directly why he would do this for a stranger over $2,000, needing to understand the reasoning before she could let herself believe in it. Marcus told her it was never about the money. It had never been about the money in any of the tests he had run over the years, in any city, with any stranger. It was about the fact that in a world that constantly rewarded people for taking whatever they could get away with, she had chosen differently without hesitation, without an audience, without any expectation of reward. That kind of decision, he told her, was rarer and more valuable than any dollar amount he could have left on that table, and it was worth more to his company than any resume could ever demonstrate. She accepted the position 2 days later, after giving her notice at Ruthie's with more gratitude than resignation, hugging her manager and co-workers and promising to visit. And after sitting her children down at the kitchen table to explain that things were about to change for their family. Malik asked if this meant he could finally join the basketball league he'd been begging for. Aaliyah, quieter and more careful, asked her mother if this was really going to last, or if it was going to disappear the way good things sometimes did. Renee told her honestly that she didn't know for certain, but that she intended to work hard enough to make sure it did. The transition wasn't instant or without adjustment. New responsibilities came with new pressures, learning logistics software and coordination systems that were entirely unfamiliar, adjusting to office culture after years of diner shifts, proving herself in an environment far different from waiting tables where the rules and expectations had been simple and direct. There were nights in the first month when she sat at her kitchen table long after the children were asleep, poring over training manuals, terrified she would fail and lose the one chance that had finally arrived. But 6 months into the role, her supervisors were already recommending her for advancement, noting the same quality Marcus had first observed in that parking lot, a steadiness of character that showed up consistently, in small moments and large ones alike, in the way she owned mistakes honestly and gave credit generously to others on her team. Marcus never spoke publicly about what he had done for Renee, and neither did she, both of them understanding instinctively that the story wasn't meant to be a public spectacle or a marketing moment for his company. It was simply the quiet continuation of a lesson his own mother had taught him decades earlier in a laundromat that no longer exists, torn down years ago to make room for a parking garage. Renee, for her part, began doing something she had never planned. She started keeping extra cash in her car specifically to help people she encountered who were struggling in small, visible ways. A stranded driver short on gas money, a young mother fumbling with exact change at a register, never mentioning where the impulse had come from, simply passing forward what had been given to her. A year after that morning in the diner, Renee had moved her family into a modest but stable rental home in a better school district. Malik's medical care fully covered under her new benefits, her back no longer aching from double shifts on her feet. Aaliyah had joined a school choir, something Renee never could have afforded to support with instrument fees and uniform costs in her old life. Renee kept the folded napkin from that day in a drawer at home, worn soft now from handling, not because she needed the reminder of what she had chosen, but because she wanted her children to understand someday that the decision itself had never been difficult. It was one of the easiest choices she had ever made, precisely because it had never really felt like a choice at all. It had simply felt like being herself. Marcus continued his quiet tests in cities across the country, though he began telling this particular story to his closest employees during leadership training sessions, not as a lesson about generosity, but as a lesson about attention, about the importance of noticing character in the moments when it costs the most to maintain it. He often ended those sessions the same way, reminding his team that money reveals almost nothing about a person's worth, but the choices someone makes when they believe no one is watching reveal almost everything. He would sometimes mention, without naming her directly, a woman who had chased him across a parking lot to return $2,000 she desperately needed, and how that single unremarkable moment had told him more about her than any interview ever could have. 2 years later, Renee was promoted again, this time into a regional operations role that put her in charge of coordinating logistics across 3 states, a position that would have seemed impossible to imagine during her years at Ruthie's. She occasionally trained new hires herself now, and found herself repeating certain phrases her own mother used to say, about character showing itself in the quiet, unwatched moments rather than the loud, visible ones. She never forgot the exhaustion of those earlier years, and she made a point of treating every employee who reported to her with the patience and respect she remembered wishing for during her hardest shifts. Marcus, watching her rise through the company over those years, felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with profit margins or logistics efficiency. It was the satisfaction of having been right about someone, of having trusted an instinct built from decades of watching people reveal themselves in ordinary moments, and having that trust rewarded not with gratitude, but with the simple continuation of the same honest character that had first caught his attention on an unremarkable Tuesday morning outside a diner in Charlotte. Gloria still runs Ruthie's Diner today, and she still tells the story of the quiet server who once chased a stranger across the parking lot to return money that wasn't hers, though she rarely mentions the name of the company that eventually hired her, respecting the same privacy Renee and Marcus had chosen from the beginning. Regulars who ask about it are usually met with the same answer Gloria has given for years, that the point was never the money and never really about the man who left it behind. The point was a woman who didn't need an audience to decide who she was going to be that morning, and who has spent every year since proving that decision was never an accident at all. If this story reminded you that honesty still matters, even when it costs something real, share it with someone who needs to hear that today, and subscribe for more stories like this one, because there are many more waiting for you right here on this channel. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.